Hi everybody, welcome to the Launch SSAT video on the types of questions that you'll come across in the SSAT reading section. So there are 4 types of questions: main idea questions, detail questions, inference questions, and vocab questions. So without further ado, let's pause this video, read the passage, and don't move on to the questions yet because we'll get to them together, and let's dive right in. Great, so let's look at the first question. So right off the bat, I can see that this is a main idea kind of question because this is asking about the passage as a whole. It's not asking about any specific part of the passage. It's not asking me to infer anything about it. It's asking me to look at the passage as a whole and decide what it's mainly about. So some tips and tricks I like to use for the main idea types of questions. I like to summarize the passage into one sentence. So looking at this passage, my sentence would probably be along the lines of Native American languages are very difficult to classify for a variety of reasons. Now let's take that sentence and let's compare it to the answers that are provided. A, the 6 families of Native American languages. While this is mentioned, this doesn't match up with my sentence. It's a little bit too detailed. It doesn't mention anything about a debate or classification. So let's move on to B, the similarities and differences between words of Native American languages. I think that was also a detail, but this is not overarching enough for a main idea type of question. C, linguistic debates about how to group languages. This seems like this might work, but it doesn't mention the words Native American. So this could be a very general idea, but this isn't necessarily specific to this passage. Let's move on. D, scholars' views about language. Maybe, but also same problem, doesn't mention Native American. And E, the classification of Native American languages. Okay, perfect. So let's go with E because this matches our sentence. It's pretty overarching and it doesn't dwell on any specific details that don't encapsulate the entire passage as a whole. So now let's look at 27, so the second question. So I can already see that this is a detail question because it asks, the scholars who believe that Native American languages can be classified into 3 families apparently believe that. So it's not something that you can necessarily know off of the top of your head. I very much doubt that even adults even know these ideas off the top of their head. So this is very clearly a detail question, and I like to go back to the passage for these types of questions and find sentences that directly spell out the answer for me, and then I'll compare them to the answers provided below. So let's take a look. A small group of linguists has recently argued that all Native American languages fit into 3 linguistic families. These scholars believe that similarities and differences among words and sounds leave no doubt about the validity of their classification scheme. So this sentence is really honing in on similarities and differences among words and sounds, and how that basically says that this should leave no question about how they should be classified. So now let's look at the answers. Languages are all related by their common origins. So origins were never brought up. So let's move on to B. Linguistic science has not advanced far enough to safely classify languages so narrowly. So I think that was a detail later on in the passage, but it doesn't answer the question we're looking for. C. Languages can be classified according to the degree of similarities and differences between words. So that's almost word for word what we read. So I'm pretty sure this is the answer. Let's just take a look at D and E just to be sure. Distinct language families have their own peculiar grammatical rules. So that wasn't mentioned. And E, these languages have diverged significantly over the last 75 years. So it doesn't say anything about anything specific. The only thing that references 75 is 3/4 of a century ago, but that was just talking about Edward Sapir. So let's not look too much into that. And because C is so similar to what we read directly in the passage, let's go with that as our answer. So far we have E and C for 1 and 2. 28. The style of the passage is most like that found in A. So this is an inference kind of question because it's not something that's directly answered by the text. You're not going to be able to go back to the passage and it's not going to say it directly there. So let's think about where we might find this kind of passage. So it seems pretty academic to me. It gives me heavy textbook vibes. Let's move on to the answers. So A, novel about about Native American tribes. Okay, so this is kind of casual, and what we're looking for is something that's more heavy, something more academic. B, Diary of a Linguist. So they do talk about linguists, but I don't think this would fit in with a diary because, first of all, those are quite personal, and second of all, those are usually written in the first person. So it's a lot of Dear Diary, today I. So let's look at C, Biography of Edward Sapir. So that does seem a little bit more academic, but they only mention Edward once, and he's not necessarily the topic of the passage. It's more about Native American languages and how there's a debate to classify them. So now let's look at D, textbook about linguistics. So that's almost exactly what we're looking for. That sounds pretty much right. So let's look at E, personal letter written by a linguistics student. So that seems a little bit more light to me than this passage is. It's not necessarily academic. Even though it's written by a student, it's a personal letter. So I believe that D is the correct answer. Let's look at 29. So once again, we have an inferential question. It directly states it can be inferred that the classification of Native American languages has been a source of controversy because let's take a look back at the passage, and although sometimes you can't necessarily find the direct answer in the passage, you can think about what it means. So you'll get a better sense of that idea when we go through this example. It says, ever since that time, the classification of Native American languages has been a source of controversy. So it's talking about a small group of linguists that think that these languages can fit into 3 linguistic families, but then most linguists reject both methods and conclusions of those scholars. So it seems like there's a lot of disagreement and that people really can't arrive to the same conclusion. So while you can see for inferential questions, there are details that can help support an answer, these details are not the answer themselves. So it's not going to be a situation of question number 27 where we found that C was literally almost exactly copy and pasted from the passage. So with inferential questions, you have to sometimes go back to the passage and read the details, but then think about, okay, but what does this actually mean? What are they actually saying? There's a lot of disagreement here. Let's take a look at the answers. There is not enough known about Native American vocabulary. They didn't necessarily mention that. They didn't mention vocabulary specifically. So let's not go with A. B, linguistics is a very new field. Whenever I come across questions in which I'm not sure if I'm supposed to know the background information about this, don't kick yourself for not knowing the answer to the question. See if it's supported by the passage, and it's not mentioned in the passage at all. So I'm not going to go with that because it's just not in the passage. If it were the other way around and I didn't know anything about it, but it was mentioned in the passage, then perhaps it could be an answer. But in this case, it's not. So let's move on to C. Languages have split in several directions. That is true, but not entirely. If we go back here, we see that these languages have diverged a lot, so they've split a lot, but that's not necessarily why there's a lot of controversy. It's more about the fact that there's a lot of disagreement, and so that's why there's a lot of controversy around it. Let's look at D. Native Americans dislike such classifications. So I don't know if that's entirely true because they didn't provide a Native American point of view. So let's look at E. Scholars do not agree on the method for classifying languages. So this is exactly what we were looking for. And so let's circle E as our final answer for that question. 30. Which of the following questions is answered by the passage? So in this kind of situation, we can see that this is sort of like a detail question. So it's asking you to go back into the passage and see if you can find a direct answer for one of these questions. And so it's also a unique situation in which you can't necessarily come up with an answer without reading through the answers first. So let's look at A. In what ways have Native American languages changed over time? B. How many Native American languages are yet to be discovered? C. Into how many families did Edward Sapir classify Native American languages? D. How many languages are in a typical linguistic family? E. Did Edward Sapir study languages other than Native American languages? I remember that C was directly mentioned, so I think he said 6. Let's go back to the passage and look. So it said, Edward Sapir, a pioneer in the field of Native American linguistics, grouped these languages into 6 families. Okay, so we have a direct answer to that question. Let's circle C. So what you want to do is not get tripped up by other questions that might be partially true, but aren't specific enough. So what you want to make sure of is that you consider all of these questions, but you find the one that has the most specific and the most direct answer to it. And so in this case, that would be C. Last question, 31. As used in the passage, extent most nearly means. So this is a vocab question that requires that we use our context clues to determine the answer to this question. So what exactly does extent mean? Even if you don't know what this word means, fear not, we can go back to the passage and find that out. Let's look for the word extent, and I see that it's in the last line. So according to these scholars, Native American languages have diverged to such an extent over the centuries that it may never be possible to group them in distinct language families. It seems like Native American languages have split a lot over the centuries to the point where you can't group them into distinct language families. Interesting. Let's go back to our answers and look through them. A, time. B, duration. C, language. D, range. E, limit. Let's say that none of these answers jump out to you. So what you can also do for these questions is you can take a look at the word that they provide as a substitute. So time in this example, and we can put them back into the passage and see how they flow. So Native American languages have diverged to such a time that doesn't make sense. B, duration. Native American languages have diverged to such a duration. So I see that A and B are about a length of time, and so that doesn't necessarily fit here. C, language. According to these scholars, Native American languages have diverged to such a language. Okay, that also does not make any sense. Let's look to D. Native American languages have diverged to such a range over the centuries. That sits really well with me. That makes a lot of sense. It seems like extent in this case is being used to illustrate the length of divergence or the length of the split that has occurred. D sounds right, and let's look at E. Native American languages have diverged to such a limit over the centuries, so it doesn't seem like there's a limit on this. So let's go back and let's choose D as our final answer.